Meanwhile, Investigative Journalism Unit AmaBhungane is reporting that Eskom has been allowed to sign a contract worth 7 billion rand with Tegeta to supply coal to a power station that will be mothballed in about 3 years from now. AmaBhungane journalist Susan Comrie joins me now to discuss this further. Susan, a very good morning to you and thank you for coming in. Quite a lot to take in these reports about deals between the Guptas and Eskom. Give us then an overall picture of how we got here.
Sure. Well, as you say, there's a lot going on at the moment. So about a year ago, Treasury launched an investigation into the first contract that Eskom signed with Tegeta. And that's been ongoing for about a year. Now, what came out at the end of this week was that their draft findings were sort of leaked to the media. And those are quite damning. Now, as part of that, they discussed sort of several contracts that Treasury had blocked as well, that Eskom had wanted to sign with Tegeta, but Treasury had said no. Now, that sort of dovetails with an investigation that we've been doing, unrelated to the Treasury investigation, which is simply looking at a number of contracts that Eskom tried to sign, and in one case did sign, with Tegeta in a space of about 15 days in August last year.
But Eskom is saying that, yes, there were these deals, 3 that you mentioned in your work, and one was supported by Treasury with conditions, the other 2 not supported. Why was that?
Well, I mean, in each case, Treasury gave different reasons. Now, in the 2 cases where they blocked the contracts, they said, well, these weren't awarded through a competitive bidding process. So you can't just hand a company a contract. You have to go out and test the market. In terms of the Constitution, you can only really award bids if the process is fair and it's competitive and cost-effective. And the only way you know that is if you go and offer the opportunity to a number of companies to bid. So in the case of R7-billion, which was an 855 million rand contract, Treasury said, you've got to have a bidding process. And what's come out in the in the Treasury document is that they've said they're convinced that if that process went through, it would actually show that the price that Tegeta was getting was exorbitant and that it wasn't the best price. So Treasury said no in that case. In the other case, you have Majuba Power Station that's being supplied by their Brakfontein mine. Now, that's the contract that's been under investigation for about a year. In terms of Eskom's, their request, they said they wanted to expand that contract, and it would have gone from 3.8 million, added on another 2.9 million, so we're setting, north of 5 billion. Now, Treasury has been doing a very intensive investigation into whether the coal quality is actually correct, whether they're delivering on the right quantities, whether the contract was valid in the first place. So it's understandable that when Treasury gets this request to say, can we give them another 2.9 billion without a tender, Treasury says, no way.
Let's zoom in then for a moment on the contract that Eskom is said to have entered with this Gupta-linked company, where this contract is for 7 years, but Eskom has taken a decision to close this particular power station within the next 2 to 3 years. How has the power utility justified that agreement, and what are the cost implications for Eskom?
Well, that's an interesting one. So Brakfontein Mines is one of the mines that Tegeta acquired as part of the Optimum deal. It always had been supplying Komati power station, and it's right next door to the power station. So it has traditionally made sense that they would supply coal. Now, when they took over the company, they were given sort of month-to-month contracts, and that happened up until August of last year. Then suddenly in August, Eskom decided they wanted to hand this massive 7-year contract to Tegeta to supply coal for the next 7 years. Now, in terms of the initial closure date for the power station, that would have possibly made sense. They still should have gone on to a tender and offered the opportunity to a number of mines in the area. They decided not to, and they say they have compelling reasons for deviating from that process. The other strange thing, though, is that 2 months after they sign the contract, Eskom's board takes the decision to say we're actually going to close this power station early. Now, Eskom won't tell me whether the officials who signed the contract were aware that that power station was going to be closed, but they certainly would have been aware that the question of the power station's future was in the balance, because they had started an investigation going back to April of last year, and they were investigating whether or not it was financially viable to keep that power station open. Now the question becomes, if you're signing month-to-month contracts, sure, maybe you extend the contract by a year, maybe you give a shorter contract. Was it really necessary to go and sign a massive contract, which now means that when that power station is mothballed, your only options, because you can't simply cancel the contract because you've decided to close the power station, your only options are you either have to pay out the rest of the contract or you have to truck the coal somewhere else. And that's got cost implications which Eskom is going to have to pick up the tab for.
Well, National Treasury says there needs to be an audit into these agreements. Eskom is saying nothing strange has happened here. What is the truth then?
Well, I guess that's the question. I mean, I think if you look at Treasury's draft findings, they certainly found a lot wrong with at least the one contract that they have looked at. They haven't gone into detail on the other contracts, although they have looked at the prepayment agreement, which also formed part of one of Tegeta's deals. It would almost be quicker to say what's actually right with the contract because there's so much wrong that Treasury has picked up. Now, Eskom no doubt will disagree with that, but you know, it then becomes a question of, well, who's right and who's wrong.
What about this audit that Treasury is calling for in this draft report? Does Treasury have power? Can they force Eskom to carry out or conduct this audit, given that the power utility insists that nothing wrong has gone on here?
Well, if I'm correct, I think what they're calling for is an independent forensic auditing firm to be appointed, and that would look into, now that couldn't be something that happened within Eskom, because one of the things that they're calling for that auditing firm to do is to investigate why, not if, but why Eskom has given preferential treatment to Tegeta. So I think if Treasury's recommendations are carried through, then we would see an independent firm being appointed, looking into all of these questions around Eskom's conduct with Tegeta and with Gupta companies.
Just how strained is the relationship, Susan, between Treasury and Eskom? I mean, we go back as far back as last year where there was this back and forth between the two over a report or documents that Eskom refused to hand over, where we actually saw Public Enterprises Minister Lynn Brown having to step in as sort of a mediator. Just how strained are the relations there, and just what will it take to fix it?
Well, it's interesting that incident where Lynn Brown had to step in, that was part of this investigation. That was the initial stages of this investigation where Treasury was asking for information. Now, I think everyone's been quite surprised that we've had a new finance minister come in, and yet Treasury has still gone ahead and has been pushing quite strongly about their points on the Tegeta contracts. Now, hopefully that's a sign that even under the new finance minister, Treasury is going to remain independent, that they're going to remain vocal, and that they're going to play a watchdog role in terms of PFMA, in terms of contracts awarded. The question is, you know, is Eskom going to be okay with that? It doesn't seem like it. Eskom has been pushing back very hard against what they've sort of been giving veiled threats that, you know, Treasury has been leaking documents and Treasury is responsible for X, Y, and Z. So it seems like that relationship is very acrimonious. I don't know that it's a bad thing, though, because I think Treasury is just doing their job. And
so where do we go from here as far as this draft report is concerned and the investigation going forward?
My understanding would be that Eskom has now submitted their final comments on the draft report, and it would be now up to Treasury to finalize that report and to make those recommendations. And then we'll have to see going forward from there. I mean, I think it would be very difficult for anyone to simply ignore instructions from Treasury if Treasury says, look, there needs to be an investigation.
All right, Susan, thank you so much for coming in this morning. That was investigative journalist Susan Comrie from the AmaBhungane Centre.